The new US federal stablecoin report is out, and it's simultaneously not as bad as I feared and just as bad as I expected. The authors of the report obviously took the time to understand stablecoins, but that didn't change what could be a bad and maybe probable outcome of their stance. Ready? Let's go. At the outset, don't be afraid. This is an important update and it won't be as dry as it seems, but it's important since stablecoins are probably just the beginning of this, what could be a new wave of crypto regulation. And this same model of regulation, at least this same type of thinking, may be used down the road to regulate other assets in crypto that are maybe even more vital to our interests than stablecoins. The President's Working Group on Financial Markets, which we've talked about before, it basically involves all the big regulators, along with the FDIC and the OCC, have finally dropped their long-awaited report on stablecoins. This is a little bit of a dry 26-page read, but we're going to break down the highlights here. And they actually do a pretty good job in the executive summary and a couple of bullet points telling you what they're going to do. We're going to go through those and then we'll get into a little more detail on this. So first thing, so you should know that this kind of paper is basically a recommendation to Congress as to what things they should pass. They're going to, in this kind of paper, they're very predictably going to lay out the risks involved in stablecoins. And they're going to hit all the stuff we suspected. They're going to talk about, money laundering and illegal activities. But it actually wasn't as much of that as I thought. I thought they were going to be talking about narco terrorists and things like that. It wasn't as much of that as I thought. It was much more a technical paper about, the real risks involved in stablecoins. And it wasn't all this dreamt up stuff like, hey, look out, drug dealers are going to be exchanging briefcases of narcotics for stablecoins tracelessly. It's mostly not that sort of stuff. They're largely worried about the same kinds of things we're worried about inside crypto with stablecoins like Tether. And you can see here, they actually took the time to sort of understand the whole stablecoin space. They laid out this very nice table which shows you just how dominant Tether is among the stablecoins. This blue right here is Tether. It's kind of a navy blue, hopefully showing up the same color on your screen. The red is USDC. This kind of aqua color is Binance USD. Then you've got DAI. Then you got True USD in yellow there. And then this final little tiny piece up here is all the other stablecoins. At the end of the report, they also told us who they talked to inform their staff as they created this paper. And when I look at the list, some of the names on the list maybe would be a little less than welcomed by the crypto community. But I'm actually glad to see names like Coinbase and Gemini and Kraken and BlockFi and Circle and Coin Center. Getting back to their actual recommendations, here's what they want Congress to pass. They say legislation should require stablecoin issuers to be insured depository institutions. That is not as simple as it sounds, and we'll get into that. They say, which are subject to appropriate supervision and regulation at the depository institution and the holding company level. You should be aware ahead of time when they say supervision, they mean an actual federal supervisor. To address concerns about payment system risk, in addition to the requirements for the actual issuers, legislation should require custodial wallet providers to be subject to appropriate federal oversight. Congress should also provide the federal supervisor, this is an actual supervisor, of a stablecoin issuer with the authority to require any entity that performs activities that are critical to the functioning of the stablecoin arrangement to meet appropriate risk management standards. Again, this is quite a bit more complicated than just saying it. Finally, they say legislation should require stablecoin issuers to comply with activities restrictions that limit affiliation with commercial entities. So they're saying stablecoin issuers would have to limit their affiliation with commercial entities. Commercial entities is a very broad category. Supervisors should have authority to implement standards to promote interoperability among stablecoins. How do you like that? The federal supervisor appointed by the feds gets to determine the standards for interoperability among the stablecoins. And then they say they're kind of like putting something on the wish list here. They say, in addition, Congress may wish to consider other standards for custodial wallet providers, such as limits on affiliation with commercial entities or on use of users' transaction data. So there's a lot to break down there. But I think at the outset, if you're paying attention, you can see this affiliation with commercial entities. This would sever a lot of the links we currently see between stablecoins and various types of entities like exchanges and various types of maybe DeFi platforms, things like that. And we're talking about a whole lot of power in the hands of these federal supervisors. This looks a lot like bank regulation. You're probably aware that bank regulation is very strict and tight, and the regulators who oversee banks have a lot of power in their hands, and they're basically imposing a very similar system on anybody who issues a stablecoin. Also want a lot of the same types of regulation on custodial wallet providers that might be interacting with stablecoins. So, I mean, when I look at this, I just at the outset, I have to ask myself, isn't the end result of this going to be to disconnect entities like Coinbase from USDC and exchanges from Tether? It sounds like, I mean, the way they're laying this out, I mean, a lot of the regulation looks like bank regulations. They say right here, we're talking about making all of the stablecoin issuers insured depository institutions. Like, we're basically going to require that all these entities be banks, and they actually say that later on. Down here on page 16, they say to accomplish these objectives, legislation should limit stablecoin issuance and related activities of redemption and maintenance of reserve assets. Right, this definitely makes you think of Djed and what's going on with Djed with the reserve assets, to entities that are insured depository institutions. They're saying anybody issuing this stablecoin, anybody engaged in related activities of redemption and maintenance of reserve assets, any of those kinds of entities or parties have to be insured depository institutions. And then down here, they give you a little bit of a definition. They say insured depository institutions include both state and federally chartered banks and savings associations, the deposits of which are covered, subject to legal limits, by deposit insurance and which have access to emergency liquidity and Federal Reserve services. So immediately you're thinking, okay, great. What about the speedy banks in Wyoming? We like them. What about Avanti Bank and Kraken Bank, and the other one, the name of which nobody can ever remember? There's at least three though. Maybe there's more now. Maybe there's 4 or 5. The last time I checked, there were like 3, and nobody can ever remember the name of the third one. But we've got Kraken and Avanti. What about them? They're great. Everybody likes Caitlin Long. So as Caitlin Long has pointed out, at least as of last month, the American Bankers Association was refusing to grant the Wyoming Speedy Bank's routing numbers. And if they don't have routing numbers, they can't make use of the Fed payment systems like ACH. And if you can't use ACH for people to go from fiat to stablecoins and other digital assets, you're not going to be super useful as a crypto bank. So it's kind of looking like the end result of all this is that only banks get to set themselves up as stablecoin issuers, or anybody that does anything with stablecoins, including redemption and maintenance of reserve assets. So anybody doing anything with stablecoins, they're going to have to be a bank. And we already know they're giving the crypto native banks like Avanti and Kraken a real hard time about being banks. I mean, they're obviously state chartered banks, which means they can kind of avail themselves of all the same rights and privileges as a federally chartered bank. It's one of the cool things about being a state chartered bank. But if you can't get a routing number from the ABA, it's going to be of limited practicality. The flip side of that coin is something else that Caitlin Long has pointed out repeatedly. She says, hey, if you regular banks from the legacy financial world try to get involved in the crypto system, there's something you may not be realizing yet. And that's that the finality and settlement times on cryptos are fundamentally incompatible with legacy financial system settlement times. If you, in like very simple in very simple, oversimplified terms, we can say, hey, if a bank goes through and they sort of settle their books every night, that's not quick enough. That's not quick enough. And they're going to experience shortfalls because the settlement times and the finality of crypto is so quick. When you're talking about ACH transactions or something like this, it's okay. You can kind of claw those back if things get screwed up. No big deal, right? The banks kind of have control of everything using some of those Fed payment systems like ACH. With crypto, that's not the case. If a bank sends crypto somewhere, they can't really claw it back. If it's a real public blockchain, they can't claw it back. Like if they send ADA to somebody, there's no way to claw that back. Like they can just sort of cancel an ACH transaction like it never happened. She thinks these legacy financial institutions aren't going to be prepared for that. It sounds like the system is kind of shaping up like we expect. We've talked about this channel before. It was sort of a question of, will the crypto entities become banks, or will the banks take over whatever chunks of the crypto business they can? Of course, the legacy financial regulators are used to regulating legacy financial institutions, so they want everything to look like a legacy financial institution. And the suspicion has always been that, the entities able to comply with all these requirements are going to be the entities that were already complying with these requirements. But whether or not, how that all pans out, that shift from, hey, we've got a bunch of stable coins out there and they're all kind of crypto entities running these stable coins, to, oh, you have to be an insured depository institution now. How does that transition take place? This is something we just don't know yet. Like we discussed earlier, they also want to regulate custodial wallet providers. So all of these, sort of retail establishments like Coinbase, when you have your wallet on Coinbase, you don't exactly have custody of those crypto assets. Regardless of whether or not you think those are in your wallet, you don't exactly have custody of those assets that are in your Cardano wallet. I'm using air quotes right here. So they're saying Congress should require custodial wallet providers to be subject to appropriate federal oversight. This oversight should include authority to restrict these service providers from lending customer stablecoins and to require compliance with appropriate risk management, liquidity, and capital requirements. So the idea of federal supervisors being in charge of the wallets at places like Coinbase sounds pretty abhorrent. But then when you think about what they're actually after here, they don't want Coinbase to be able to lend out your stable coins that you deposit at Coinbase. And they also want Coinbase to comply with appropriate risk management, liquidity, and capital requirements. This kind of makes sense because if we're worried about Tether and whether or not there's actual capital backing up all the Tether that's been printed, we also need to worry about the entities that are holding custody of Tether. If they're taking in a ton of Tether and then they're doing things like lending out your Tether, and they don't actually have the Tether. If everybody makes sort of a custodial wallet provider run, that's a problem as well. Out of all the language in this paper, this paragraph right here on page 17, it's sort of the second full paragraph, but the third paragraph, if you count these two lines on top, this paragraph down here is the one that worries me the most. They say, hey, in addition to stablecoin issuers and custodial wallet providers, other entities may perform activities that are critical to the functioning of the stablecoin arrangement. And predictably, they say Congress should provide the federal supervisor of the issuer with the authority to require any of these additional entities that perform activities critical to the stablecoin arrangement to meet appropriate risk management standards. And then they name some standards like this one, principles for financial market infrastructures as adapted to stablecoin arrangements. So we should be aware with this paragraph, this is a very broad category. Other entities that may perform activities that are critical to the functioning of the stablecoin arrangement. So pretty much anybody else who they think is critical to the functioning of the stablecoin, they can say, hey, you have to report to the federal supervisor as well. And the federal supervisor is going to impose certain standards on you as they are adapted for stablecoins. Interestingly, this is also the same paragraph where they say supervisors should have the ability to adopt standards to promote interoperability among stablecoins or between stablecoins and other payment instruments. This is very broad. This is a very broad wheelhouse for this federal supervisor of the issuer. They get to decide how stable coins interact with other stable coins and with other payment systems. And they can also say that any entity that performs something critical for the functioning of the stablecoin also has to report to them and to meet these risk management compliance standards. This is very broad language. What I'm afraid of is that this is the type of language that eventually could sweep in a lot of different types of entities. You think about Djed and its sort of triple coin system with reserve assets. They're obviously going to try to sweep in anybody who's involved with providing liquidity in the reserve of coins like that. We've talked before about the genius of having Coty, which falls outside of North America or the European Union, be the issuer of Djed. I think that was a genius move. But for a lot of these blockchains that are deeply entrenched in DeFi already, and I think we can name a lot of our big competitors, including our biggest, most established competitor, a big chunk of what they've got going on, even more so prior to sort of the arrival of the NFT explosion. But even now, even with NFTs, a big part of the activity of those blockchains is tied up in DeFi. And a lot of DeFi needs stable coins. And if all of this gets condensed down, if to issue a stablecoin, you've got to be an insured depository institution. To have anything to do with the stablecoin, you've got to report to the federal supervisor of that insured depository institution. I mean, it's not a gigantic leap to say that you could see a big portion of the stablecoin space moving over to the legacy financial institutions, which is not anything anybody in crypto wants to hear. But I mean, that kind of these recommendations, they would kind of push things in that direction. And to be fair, these are just recommendations at this point. So we've got to wait and see how much of this Congress actually adopts. But they're definitely pushing things in exactly the direction we thought, where we have to start asking ourselves a question. Are crypto entities who engage with stablecoins going to start looking more like banks, or are banks just going to take over gigantic chunks of the stablecoin business? But either way, it's going to massively change things for these blockchains that are already deeply entrenched in DeFi, the way the crypto space has always done DeFi. Whereas a blockchain like Cardano, we're kind of starting right now. We can do it in the most beneficial way. We don't have to tear things down and rebuild. We can build things in whatever is the most optimal way to operate, given whatever Congress does with these recommendations, because what they're suggesting here does massively change the way crypto operates anytime it touches stablecoins. This is going to be a long-term thing we're going to have to keep an eye on. And in the meantime, I'll talk to you tomorrow.